Stalin and His Six Marshals. In Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, amidst a wave of fiery revolutions and a relentless World War II, a group of valiant fighters and indomitable commanders became key players in history. In the midst of it all, their leader, a complex and contradictory figure named Joseph Stalin, became the centerpiece of the drama. His finger drew the battle lines on the map, and his gaze of intellect and strength intertwined with cold calculation to create an empire that was formidable, but also full of bitterness and contradiction. This issue will present his story with six marshals. 1. Marshal Kliment Voroshilov. Kliment Voroshilov, a name that shines with unique splendor in the annals of Russian military history, was born into an ordinary Russian family in 1890 in the shadow of the Ural Mountains, and grew into an outstanding military leader in the days that followed. There is no doubt that he was not born into a royal or aristocratic family, but in spite of this he managed to rise to the rank of field marshal in the army by virtue of his military intelligence and determination. He was part of the Tsarist Russian army and wore Prussian-style uniforms and a barbed fur cap. It was in this environment that Voroshilov forged into a brilliant, fearless military leader. There are many major military battles and tactical decisions that can be attributed to Kliment Voroshilov during World War II, but perhaps his proudest example is his performance at the Battle of Kursk in 1943. This battle is considered to be the largest tank battle of World War II and the largest defensive battle in history. During the battle, Voroshilov assumed primary command of the Soviet army. Although the Germans brought together a massive tank force and developed ambitious plans to undermine the Soviet defenses under Voroshilov's resolute command and decisive tactics, the Soviet army managed to stop the German offensive and won a decisive victory in the ensuing counteroffensive. In this battle, Voroshilov's art of command and military vision played a key role. He correctly judged the situation on the battlefield, had a clear understanding of the possible tactics of the Germans, and remained calm in the tense situation. His leadership and military talent were on full display in this historic battle. The victory at the Battle of Kursk marked a strategic turnaround for the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front of World War II, where the Germans never again took the initiative. This victory played a key role in the final defeat of Nazi Germany, the defense of the territorial integrity of the USSR, as well as changing the situation of the war in Europe and the world. Therefore, it can be said that the Battle of Kursk was the brilliant work of Kliment Voroshilov's military career and his proudest example. However, even such a hero could not resist the passage of time. In 1970, Voroshilov left this world, but his image in the minds of people still comes to life. His spirit, his valor, his leadership are deeply imprinted in the military history of Russia. The relationship between Kliment Voroshilov and Stalin was full of complications and twists. As one of the Soviet Union's most important military leaders and politicians, Voroshilov played an important role in Stalin's leadership, but the relationship between these two men was not always peaceful. Initially, Stalin greatly admired and praised Voroshilov's military prowess. In fact, Stalin promoted Voroshilov to chief of the Red Army General Staff at the start of World War II, a position that made Voroshilov Stalin's most important military advisor. During the war, his strategic thinking and leadership were crucial to the Soviet Union's victory. However, the relationship between Stalin and Voroshilov was not always harmonious. Conflicts between the two men usually occurred over military strategy and war-guiding principles. Voroshilov publicly criticized Stalin's decisions on several occasions and was retaliated against by Stalin for doing so. Despite his excellent leadership of the Red Army, Voroshilov's apparent defiance of Stalin made Stalin very disappointed in him. Stalin would often criticize and reprimand Voroshilov very harshly, which made the relationship between the two men even more strained. Kliment Voroshilov's experience in Stalin's purges was undoubtedly one of the most difficult and awe-inspiring years of his entire career. In 1937, the storm of the Great Purge swept through the Soviet Union, and it was like a raging tidal wave that swept countless heroes into its wake. As a senior military leader, Voroshilov was not spared. In the late fall of that year, he was falsely accused of participating in a counter-revolutionary plot, arrested and thrown into prison. For a time in prison, he experienced the pain of being clubbed and punished with paprika under the hands of cold-hearted jailers. However, his conviction did not waver, and his suffering in prison even sharpened his determination. The reason why Stalin finally chose to spare Klim Voroshilov is multifaceted. First of all, Voroshilov's innocence was ironclad. During the scrutiny that took place after his arrest, although there was a certain amount of bias and pressure, it failed to find enough evidence to prove that he was involved in any conspiracy against the government. Further, during the trial, Voroshilov's honesty and candor and steadfastness made the trial body suspicious of him. Therefore, he was eventually acquitted under Stalin's reign of terror during the Great Purge. Secondly, Stalin was well aware of Voroshilov's military prowess and leadership. Voroshilov's achievements at the front and on the battlefield earned him great prestige, which made him an important figure for Stalin and the military. In addition, Stalin realized that in these turbulent times, he had an even greater need for people like Voroshilov, whose expertise and leadership were vital to the security of the Soviet Union. Finally, Stalin may have wanted to show his compassion and justice by releasing Voroshilov. With the climax of the Great Purge behind him, Stalin may have needed to ease tensions at home by showing that he could also treat the wrongly imprisoned with leniency, thus easing the people's fears and dissatisfaction with the regime through such an act. Therefore, Stalin chose to spare Klim Voroshilov for a number of reasons. 2. Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Georgy Zhukov was born in 1896 in an era of social unrest in the Russian Empire. His life is a testament to the fact that with determination and perseverance, one can make a mark on the stage of world history, even from an ordinary background. Zhukov's early life was not a smooth one. He was born in Kologa, a small town with a high illiteracy rate that depended on agriculture for its livelihood. However, his vast knowledge and deep insights began to unfold during his childhood. Being intelligent and hardworking, Zhukov developed an early interest in military strategy. However, the moment that really tested him was in World War II. He joined millions of soldiers on the front lines, risking their lives and traveling the line of death. Zhukov is regarded as one of the Soviet Union's top strategists of World War II, and he distinguished himself in many battles. However, Zhukov's best battle may have been the defense of Moscow. The battle took place in the winter of 1941, when Nazi Germany's Blitzkrieg offensive was putting serious pressure on the Soviet Union, and Moscow looked like a piece of meat hanging in the mouth of a deer dolphin with no chance of winning. At this time, Zhukov was appointed as the commander of the Moscow defense line, and he was entrusted with the responsibility of defending Moscow to the best of his ability. Zhukov advocated an active defense strategy. He emphasized the importance of defense in depth and actively relied on natural conditions such as terrain and climate to set up the defense line. He constantly adjusted the position of the defense line, making it impossible for the Germans to accurately judge the true position of the Soviet defense line. At the same time, he also vigorously mobilized troops and materials in the rear to ensure that the defensive forces at the front were adequately supplied. As winter approached, Zhukov took advantage of the extreme cold weather in the Soviet Union and canceled all heating facilities, leaving the German troops stranded in the bitter cold and virtually sapping their strength and morale. This was Zhukov's main battle strategy in the defense of Moscow. These tactics of his were ultimately successful in stopping the German attack on Moscow and gaining valuable breathing time for the Soviet Union, thus setting the stage for the eventual Soviet victory. This is one of the main reasons why Zhukov is widely praised. The relationship between Zhukov and Stalin can be characterized as tense and complex. Their interactions mixed interdependence and apparent conflict, especially during World War II. Stalin recognized Zhukov's military brilliance, and he would very frequently ask Zhukov to take over new major assignments. Stalin even promoted Zhukov to commander-in-chief of the Red Army in the 1940s, arguably the greatest recognition of Zhukov's military brilliance. Stalin had already achieved many victories under Zhukov's leadership, and he had even said that without Zhukov, the Soviet Union might not have been able to resist the German attack. However, the relationship between Stalin and Zhukov was not always harmonious. They often argued over differences in war strategy. Zhukov's frankness and forthrightness sometimes provoked Stalin's displeasure, and his military opinions were often at odds with Stalin. Stalin's strong personality and his habit of having absolute control over decision-making often led to heated arguments between the two men. Zhukov was ignored during the purges, even though he had opposing views on Stalin's policies. During this period, 4 of his lieutenants were arrested and executed, but Zhukov himself was not captured. Despite the mass arrests and executions among his colleagues, Zhukov managed to maintain his role and survive this dark period of history. After the end of World War II, Zhukov's military prowess and prestige was highly recognized by the entire Soviet population, making him the most recognizable Soviet figure besides Stalin. This was certainly a great threat to Stalin. Stalin began to worry that Zhukov might challenge his authority, and therefore, he decided to suppress Zhukov. In 1946, Stalin used an opportunity regarding the reform of the military leadership to remove Zhukov from the position of People's Commissar for Defense of the USSR and replace him with himself. Zhukov was appointed as the commander of the Urals military district, which was equivalent to being relegated to a local level. In addition, Stalin instructed some military journalists and military historians to deliberately ignore or minimize Zhukov's contributions when writing the history of World War II, and even deleted Zhukov's name from some documents and public reports. Since then, Zhukov's influence has gradually diminished within the Soviet Union. However, although Zhukov was not fully rehabilitated from his military position, he continued to have a significant impact on a variety of areas, including military scholarship. He lent his teaching experience and writings to an in-depth study of military theory and strategic tactics, leaving a fruitful legacy of military thought for future generations. 3. Field Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky. Konstantin Rokossovsky, a name that shines in the annals of history and whose story is like a vivid historical novel, was born into a Jewish family in 1896 in those turbulent years, and his life has always been closely connected with the intertwined struggles of the military, politics, and personal beliefs. During World War II, he was involved in many important battles. However, one of his most celebrated battles would probably be the defense of Stalingrad. The defense of Stalingrad took place between August 23, 1942 and February 2, 1943, and is known as one of the largest and bloodiest urban battles of World War II. Field Marshal Rokossovsky demonstrated exceptional command skills during this battle. Primarily responsible for coordinating and directing the counterattacks in the early days, Rokossovsky was responsible for the integration of a large number of armies, including the Gruppenführer, and the careful layout of the armies stationed in the cities. With an iron will and high military character, he was determined not to retreat and commanded the Red Army in its deadly resistance against the Germans at Stalingrad. Marshal Rokossovsky then carried out 2 successive important counterattack operations to encircle the German forces around Stalingrad, thus cutting off their supply lines. These 2 operations had a major impact on the course of the battle, allowing the Soviet Red Army to gradually gain the upper hand. Finally, in February 1943, Nazi Germany's main fighting force in the Battle of Stalingrad surrendered to the Soviet Red Army, ending the protracted campaign. Victory in this battle marked a turn in the tide of World War II, with the complete failure of Germany's strategic offensives and the beginning of the gradual advance of the Eastern Front into Germany itself. The relationship between Konstantin Rokossovsky and Stalin was full of complications and contradictions. Rokossovsky, being a member of the Red Army, certainly could not avoid contact with Stalin. Their relationship, which ranged from a time of friendship and mutual understanding to misunderstanding and conflict, reflects the intense struggles of the era. As a young man, Rokossovsky came to admire Stalin's strategy of rule. Stalin's style of leadership and proletarian philosophy had a profound effect on him, leading him to choose to join the ranks of those fighting for the socialist cause. But as time went on, things began to change. As Rokossovsky developed a deeper understanding of Stalin's policies, he began to have doubts about Stalin's totalitarian rule. Rokossovsky always believed in the ideals of socialism and tried to push Stalin's rule of the Soviet Union in that direction. However, Stalin's authoritarian style of rule clashed with Rokossovsky's ideals. This conflict evolved into a blatant dispute that eventually led to a breakdown in their relationship. Rokossovsky's encounters with the Great Purge were filled with shocking bitterness. In 1937, Rokossovsky became one of the victims of the purge when he was arrested by the secret police. He was taken and subjected to inhuman torture, and it seemed that his life was about to come to an abrupt end. During his detention, Rokossovsky was forced to confess to a number of crimes he had never committed, a common evil in purges at the time. Despite the severe physical and psychological trauma Rokossovsky suffered during the purges, he was miraculously found not guilty and regained his freedom. This was due to the fact that his case was re-examined and ruled in his favor when Stalin needed him to provide military guidance to the Soviet Union during World War II. The horrors of the Great Purge led to generations of people losing their lives or their reputations, and what happened to Rokossovsky is undoubtedly a vivid portrayal of these horrific times. The humiliation he suffered, and the pain that followed him throughout his life. Rokossovsky's art of command in the defense of Stalingrad made him a colorful part of military history. However, every man's life eventually comes to an end. In 1970, Rokossovsky gently closed his eyes and died quietly. 4. Marshal Aleksandr Ivanovich Yegorov. Aleksandr Ivanovich Yegorov, a name carved into the deep walls of history. It was 1883, he was born in a family full of expectations for the future. His life, like a bitter historical novel, was full of glory and melancholy, because he was a Soviet marshal, a revolutionary, and a statesman. As a young man, Yegorov was always filled with passion and eagerness to pursue, and his very different nature made him passionate about the knowledge of the world and the pursuit of justice and truth. After the end of World War I, with the vigor of youth and the expectation of the future, he joined the Bolsheviks, and from then on began his thrilling historical journey. Marshal Aleksandr Ivanovich Yegorov was actually only a young commander during the Soviet Civil War, but the talent he displayed during this conflict stands as a beacon. At the time, he was fighting in the south against Ukrainian forces. In 1919, Yegorov was appointed as an advisor to Tukhachevsky, after which he served as a commander in the battles for Petrograd and Moscow. Subsequently, he also played an important role in the mediation of opposition forces on the Southern Front. During this period, Yegorov's leadership and firmness earned him favorable reviews from the upper echelons of the military. It was during the Civil War, however, that Yegorov demonstrated perhaps his most outstanding talent for his understanding and use of advanced military tactics. He had an in-depth understanding of how to make the most effective use of modern weapons, including tanks and aircraft, and successfully applied these concepts to actual combat. This played a crucial role in the Soviet Union's successful resistance to Germany in the later stages of World War II. His relationship with Stalin can be described in one word: complicated. These two individuals left a profound impact on the political history of the Soviet Union, and their relationship reflected the strong impulses and contradictions of the era. Yegorov excelled during the Civil War, and his military genius took his place in the Soviet military. However, his military prowess did not allow him to forge a strong relationship with Stalin. Instead, their political differences alienated them from each other. Stalin's policy of iron-fisted rule was in serious conflict with Yegorov's ideas on how to deal with domestic political problems. Although his military prowess brought victory to the USSR, his influence was not comparable to Stalin's in political contests. His emotionalism clashed with Stalin's pragmatism, and he preferred to solve problems through peaceful means, while Stalin believed in an iron fist to assert his authority. Ivanovich Yegorov was not immune to the bloody period of Soviet history known as the Great Purge. In many ways, what happened to him reflects the cruelty and despair of that time. Surrounded by the eyes of people angry with fear, Yegorov felt a deep sense of being pushed into a corner by invisible hands, and in 1939 he was arrested and characterized as a counter-revolutionary. From then on, he was imprisoned in a cold cell, where the light between the four walls was sparse and the darkness smelled of death. He was stripped of his honor, persecuted, and the glory days of the past faded from his eyes, replaced by constant and inexplicable interrogation and torture. When he was interrogated, he was forced to confess to crimes of which he had no knowledge. Asserting his innocence to them was obviously of no avail. For in those days when fear ruled, the truth became so small that it could not be resisted in the face of cold power. It was all a prelude to tragedy, and in the end he was sentenced to death for counter-revolution. Thus, Ivanovich Yegorov's life came to an abrupt end in the midst of a political purge. His story is a vivid example of the atrocities of the purges and reveals the harsh reality of the power struggle. It is a heartbreaking story about how a great marshal, a hero of the country, lost everything in the political purge. 5. Field Marshal Mikhail Vasilievich Tukhachevsky. Mikhail Vasilievich Tukhachevsky was born in 1893, a time of vicissitudes and social upheaval. His hometown was in Krasnoyarsk, a city in Russian Siberia, where the cold, harsh climate was as unpredictable as his future. As a young man, working in a bank that had gone bankrupt, Tukhachevsky's heart nurtured a huge dream. Those days spent behind the counter, those bills and coins in his hands, those customers who came and went with all kinds of expectations and disappointments, became mirrors for him to think about life and understand it. He learned how to see through the complexity of human nature, how to see the inner pattern of things through the surface. However, his destiny was not closed by the window of this small-town bank. 1915, when he was only 22 years old, he enlisted in the army and experienced the horrors of war as an infantryman in the First World War. He witnessed the brutality of war, the pervasiveness of humanity, and the vivid moments of burning passion. This experience on the edge of life and death gave him a deeper understanding of the nature of war, and his keen insight and vast experience marked him out from the rest. With the end of the war, Tukhachevsky joined the newly formed Red Army, where he began to show exceptional leadership skills. His understanding of military tactics and the courage and decisiveness he showed in managing his troops led to his rapid advancement. Not content with this, he began to study military theory, trying to find more effective methods of combat. These years of hard work were not in vain, and he gradually built up a reputation in the Soviet army as an outstanding military theorist and commander. His military theory and practice had a profound impact on military thinking in the Soviet Union and throughout the world. It was during the Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1922, that Tukhachevsky first demonstrated exceptional leadership. In his capacity as the principal commander of the Soviet Red Army's eastern and southern fronts, he successfully fended off white attacks. Among these, his victories in the Urals and Volga were particularly important because they prevented the White Army from uniting and threatening the heartland of the Soviet Union. In addition, Tukhachevsky was an important figure in the deepening and development of Soviet military doctrine, introducing the concept of deep war. This doctrine emphasized the use of mobility and firepower in comprehensive and continuous Warsaw Pact army operations to penetrate enemy defenses in depth. This became the primary tactic of the Soviet Union against the Germans during World War II. Mikhail Tukhachevsky's brilliance was unquestionable. However, his relationship with Stalin was intricate and full of twists and turns. In the 1920s, Tukhachevsky began to make a name for himself in the Soviet army. However, it was at this time that he began to have serious disagreements with Stalin. Tukhachevsky, as a military theorist, believed that the Soviet Union should transform its military strategy by advocating the use of deep combat and armored units in actual combat. Stalin, however, favored a more conservative and defensive strategy, preferring man-o-war tactics. These two strategic ideas were in serious conflict and undoubtedly put a major strain on the relationship between the two men. Not only that, but as time went on, Stalin's authoritarianism became more and more apparent, and his control over the army became harsher and harsher. Tukhachevsky, on the other hand, had always believed that the soul of the army lay in its freedom to think and innovate, and he was opposed to Stalin's authoritarianism, especially his excessive control over the army. In 1930, when Tukhachevsky openly criticized Stalin's way of managing the army, Stalin's attitude towards Tukhachevsky's opposition worsened. He began to see Tukhachevsky as a potential threat and gradually marginalized him. In the Soviet Union of the 1930s, Stalin held the reins of leadership, and the social climate in the country became increasingly repressive under his rule, and people began to feel a deep sense of fear. This was also the backdrop for the intense Great Purge, a political purge in which many people, including Tukhachevsky, suffered. The purges began in 1936 with Stalin's constant search for and creation of enemies and the brutal arrests and trials of anyone who might threaten his power. Tukhachevsky was one of those marked. In 1937, he was arrested and tried in a court of law on charges of conspiracy against the Soviet Union and treason. No matter how much Tukhachevsky defended and protested, his voice could not penetrate the dark night of the purges. In the end, he was executed. His life, his efforts and talents were mercilessly snuffed out in the purges. That morning, no one could see the despair and helplessness in his heart. His once wise and courageous eyes could not resist the cruel fate. Stalin's purges not only brought Tukhachevsky's personal demise, but also destroyed the Soviet Union's military power and delayed the effective blockade of Nazi Germany. Despite Tukhachevsky's imprisonment, his contributions and ideas were decisive for the Soviet victory in World War II, and his name and influence will live on in history. 6. Marshal Aleksandr Vasilievich Maslenkov. Aleksandr Vasilievich Maslenkov, a name that has become a historical symbol of the 20th century. However, his historical contribution is reflected not only in his military achievements throughout his life. Born in 1893, Maslenkov's early life did not bring him much superiority and convenience. Instead, he spent a poverty-stricken childhood in Krasnoyarsk, Russia, where he found a meager livelihood at a nearly bankrupt local bank. However, the young Maslenkov never lost faith in life. Gradually, his passion began to be drawn to the military and his country. He saw the needs of his country and his duty and mission as a soldier. In the midst of the complexity of the war, Maslenkov gradually showed his leadership skills. He had unique military insights and a distinctive vision, rejecting traditional military tactics and advocating a more scientific and efficient way of fighting. His performance in World War II was impressive and earned him a widely acclaimed military reputation. Among the many battles, the Soviet Union's fight against Germany on the Kharkov's front was particularly notable. This battle was a key part of the Soviet Union's push for the retreat of Nazi Germany. Maslenkov's forces managed to stop the German attack in a skillful use of terrain, marching, and precise military strikes, an important victory for the Soviet line. In the Battle of Kharkov, his troops showed great tenacity and determination, winning despite facing significant challenges. Maslenkov's relationship with Stalin was quite good. They were close allies during the war and fought together against aggression from the fascists. Many historians believe that Stalin would not have been able to successfully resist the onslaught of Nazi Germany without Maslenkov's intellect and courage. Stalin had the utmost respect for Maslenkov's military brilliance and strategic vision, and he saw Maslenkov as the ideal military leader, as evidenced by the fact that Maslenkov succeeded Zhukov as chief of the general staff. After Maslenkov succeeded Zhukov as chief of the general staff, the methods he adopted to get along were not necessarily superior to Zhukov's, but some of his characteristics and behaviors did help him maintain a good relationship with Stalin. First of all, Maslenkov was a very sensible and shades of temperate man. He was well aware that his power was bestowed from Stalin and always maintained his respect for him. He knew very well that under Stalin's rule, his authority could not be challenged under any circumstances. Although he was honest and upright, he knew equally well when to keep silent and when to give his opinion. Secondly, Maslenkov possessed exceptional military brilliance, and his strategies and tactics played a key role in the Soviet Union's victory in World War II. He guided the Soviet army to many crucial victories on the battlefield, which undoubtedly earned Stalin's trust and respect. Furthermore, Maslenkov was good at interpersonal communication. He knew how to maintain a good relationship with Stalin under Stalin's strict rules, as well as how to win the trust and love of his soldiers. His leadership style was disciplined and passionate, which was very important to Stalin and differentiated him from Zhukov. Finally, his loyalty was also undoubtedly an important factor in Stalin's trust in him. Stalin once said that he valued loyalty above all else, and Maslenkov demonstrated selfless devotion to Stalin and the Soviet Union throughout his career. Stalin held Maslenkov in extremely high regard. He always had great respect for Maslenkov's military prowess and bestowed great trust on Maslenkov in his position as head of the Soviet army. Stalin once said that Maslenkov was the chief guide of my army, which shows his high opinion of Maslenkov. However, although Stalin had a high opinion and respect for Maslenkov, this did not mean that their relationship was always harmonious. Stalin was politically devious and cunning and could sacrifice his friends and allies for his own political goals. So although Maslenkov's performance in the war won Stalin's admiration, he was also alienated and questioned by Stalin in his later political struggles. Stalin briefly dismissed Maslenkov as chief of the general staff, which may have reflected a wavering of his political trust in Maslenkov. However, Maslenkov was reinstated shortly afterward, which also shows Stalin's regard and trust in Maslenkov's professional abilities. He was awarded the title of Marshal of the Soviet Union by Stalin in 1943. That's all for this installment. Thanks for watching.